You both brought up Fed policy as a potential part of the blame game here. Uh, Earlier, last couple of years, they've kept interest rates super low. It basically blew up all these assets, created these tech bubbles, crypto bubbles, and blew up their deposits in these banks. And they had to put the money somewhere. And then they were getting forward guidance from these central bankers that they weren't going to raise interest rates, right? And the forward expectations in terms of the market also thought that inflation was going to be transitory, quote unquote, right? So how much blame is put on the Fed for not seeing inflation coming?
It's all on the Fed.
You think it's all the Fed? Why don't you go deeper?
They're the arsonist and they're the firefighter, right? So they're the arsonist. So to your point, I mean, we can go back as far back as we want to 1913 when they were created. But if we just look back to the pandemic, right? I mean, in 2020, between the Fed and the Treasuries, somewhere around $11 trillion was pumped into the system. Where does that money go? Well, most of it found its way into the banks. In 2021, some of you guys might remember that some of the banks were saying, "Whoa, we don't want any more cash. Don't give us any more deposits. Reinvest into your business. Send it to another bank." Like they didn't know what to do with it. So the bank balances swelled, and then what do they do with that money? Well, they're trying to find a place to put it. A lot of it goes into treasuries. So for numbers, SVB balance swelled from 60 billion to 190 billion. In about a year and a half, from 60 to 190. And so the Fed was the arsonist. They created this fire. They put all this money out there. These bank balances swelled. They pushed them into these treasuries. And at the time, the treasuries were still down. The interest rates were still down at zero. And then to your point, Sam, you're absolutely right. They've given all that forward guidance. We're not thinking about raising rates. They said they wouldn't raise rates for 4 years. So no one really expected them to raise rates till about 2024. We all knew better. The bank should have known better. It's not really, we can't let them off the hook, but certainly it's the Fed's fault. They put all this money in the system. They took all that money into the bonds. Then they raised the rates, which then brought it back down. And so they caused the fire. Now they're trying to solve it. So all the blame goes to the Fed.
Yeah.
So my view is a little bit different. I see the Fed as more of only the firefighter, but a very, very bad one. Like you're better off without this firefighter. To me, the arsonist is the Treasury and the Senate and public policy, because they're the ones that can't run a proper budget. The government is now going to be perpetually $1 trillion in the deficit every single year. And that's where it starts. And now the Fed has certainly made mistakes. Mostly the predecessors of Jerome Powell made the bigger mistakes, where they lowered the interest rate too low, they keep it there way too long. And because of that, we ended up with an extended zero interest rate between like 2009 all the way till 2015. And after COVID, again, it dropped way too low and it stayed a little too low there. So they're just really, really terrible at their job by doing what they're doing. And they're forced to always bail out the government by coming up with these schemes that end them into trouble. Now,
but it's not just the government though. They have to bail out all the corporations. They have to bail out the mortgage industry. So in 2020, right, they started buying private bonds, corporate bonds. Yeah. And so you're absolutely right. The government can't live within their means. It's way more than $1 trillion per year. The Treasury had to borrow almost $1 trillion just this first quarter, 932 billion. Quarter one, right?
Yeah, Mark. No, you're right. I mean, the Fed does also do silly things, but the government was certainly encouraging these policies of anyone needs to own a home and anyone should get a mortgage. Wall Street was just repackaging the stuff that others wanted to buy. There's plenty of blame to go around.
Sure.
But personally, I start with the Treasury, then I go to the Fed.
Yeah. I mean, it's fair, right? I mean, obviously the Treasury, to your point, can't live within their means. And they also, like I said, it was about between the Treasury and the Fed, there was about 11 trillion. So they were, almost equal in that kind of, increase in the money supply back then. But the Fed, to your point, is the one that sets the price of money. And most people listening here, I'm sure, probably already understand that price fixing never works. It leads to shortages and higher prices. And the Fed is basically price fixing. They're setting the price of money, which sets the price of everything. But yeah, Tone, there's certainly enough blame to go around.
Yeah, not really, and also look at it, right? Anytime, at any point, the whoever's in charge of the Fed is usually the more responsible person versus the one at the Treasury. Right now, we're looking at Yellen versus Powell. Back in 2008, it was Bernanke versus Paulson. You can clearly see which one is actually trying to help and which one is just there for their friends. They're stuck between their corporate buddies, where they usually come from, and reporting directly to the government. Fed at least has maybe 10 to 15% independence, but a Treasury has zero.
Yeah, and it seems like we're seeing a little bit of a shift in the Fed. You know, I kind of buy into this theory. Well, we're all Bitcoiners here, so we all buy into the theory that probably the number one piece of FUD that we would hear from a no coiner would be that the governments or whatever would never allow, the central bankers would never allow Bitcoin because they wouldn't have a competing form of money, which is true. Who controls the money controls the world, but who controls what money? And so what I've seen kind of shaping up is I kind of take the viewpoint that the Fed, Jamie Dimon and the Fed wants to control the money as the US dollar. They don't want to give up control to the ECB, right? They don't want to give up control to the PBOC or whatever it is, right? And so it looks like the Fed is starting to work more independently from the Treasury, where the Treasury, the Obama-Biden administration, wants to be in bed with the EU, ECB, Davos group, $130 trillion over the next 30 years for this, green energy transition. And the Fed's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, we're not doing that. We want to keep control over money. We want to keep the dollar strong. And I think there's this rift going on between the Fed and the Treasury.
Oh yeah, 100%. And for those listening that aren't very familiar, and everyone always talks about the Fed, especially in the crypto space, the main job of the Treasury is to lend money to all of the other government departments, or themselves for that matter, when those departments can't live within their means. So when the education department doesn't have enough money, Treasury creates government bonds and they give them the money. And the Fed is responsible for kind of making all that work at the end. But it's the Treasury that actually creates this money out of thin air, like your bank giving you a mortgage. The Treasury does that for all government departments and all government initiatives. So to me, that's where it all starts. And then the Fed just tries to do the best it can with the situation it has. And very often it does a very bad job and makes things worse.
Yeah, it's monetary policy versus fiscal policy. So the monetary policy of the Fed is basically setting the price of money, and the fiscal policy is then controlling the budgets of all the different departmts. I want to bounce back to something that Tone said though a minute ago, where you were kind of saying really what they've done is kind of put a hurting on like the smaller banks, like the more regional banks. But I would actually that certainly is true. But I think the Fed, through their reckless abandon of raising rates at the fastest rate, I think since whatever last 4 or 5 decades. They've bankrupted themselves. They've bankrupted the Treasury, and now they've bankrupted the banks. So we've seen the Fed, right? The Fed is losing money. They're a bank, right? We've all seen the picture of the balance sheet and then just the drop off the cliff, right? Now they're just putting all those losses off to the side. Let's just not talk about those. Let's not look at those. So the Fed is essentially bankrupt, right? They're as a bank, right? Their liabilities exceed their income. The Treasury is now bankrupt, right? So the Treasury is in this tough situation where their interest payments are going up. Now, $31.5 trillion of debt is all due at different maturities, but already they can't afford the interest on the debt. That's why this whole debt ceiling is, if we don't take on more debt, we can't, we're going to default. We know that 30% of that $31.5 trillion has to be refinanced in the next 12 months. 30% of it, 50% has to be refinanced in the next 36 months. And that's going to be an average an interest rate right now. It's an average interest rate of 1.7. Once that gets refinanced, it's going to be between 3.5% to 5%, depending on where rates are going to be. And so what we're seeing is the interest payments on the $31.5 trillion are going up at the same time as the Fed is crushing demand to fight inflation. And so that crushing demand has had a drop in tax receipts. So we've seen federal tax receipts drop by 9%. At the same time, interest payments are going up. And so the Treasury can't even afford that. And now the banks are bankrupt. So all three are bankrupt at this point.